Thank you for the very kind introduction, Roland, and to the Dean and to Ed for inviting me to give this presentation, and congratulations to the Asia Center's longevity. I hope it's another half a century plus or more that the Asia Center is operating and continuing to encourage Asian studies here at the University of the Philippines. Also thank everybody, various organizations that have co-sponsored this event with the Asia Center. Over the last, I still do research on the Philippines, but I must admit it's taken a back seat to research I've been doing over the last 15 years or so, emphasizing Vietnam. What Roland mentioned by way of the connection is between the Philippines and Vietnam has to do with agrarian politics and peasant issues and living conditions in the two countries. And I've done a bit of comparison of that between the Philippines and Vietnam. This new research I've been taking on is really, in a way, moving away from the word or the concept of everyday politics to looking at public politics. I'm still interested in everyday politics, but this research I've been doing, I put under the broad rubric of public political criticism in contemporary Vietnam. What's attracted me to that in part has been a disconnect between how Vietnam is often portrayed in the media outside of Vietnam about its political system, how people are treated and so forth. That compared to what as I lived in Vietnam from time to time, doing research on other topics and talking to people, reading the local press, begin to see that those portrayals from the outside don't measure up too well to what I've been starting to observe. More specifically, it's often the case that foreign commentary about Vietnam's political system stresses the repressive, intolerant aspects of dissent. Let me read a couple of examples. A recent Associated Press statement from a journalist who was reporting from Hanoi. He had been there apparently for a few weeks. Said, quote, "The government does not tolerate any challenge to one-party rule." The Freedom House, which regularly comes out pretty much annually with assessments of political dissent and the like in various parts of the world, including Vietnam, reported in 2010, last year, the Communist Party government in Vietnam silences critics, quote unquote, and they do so by many means. Zachary Abusa, who has written the only book that I'm aware of in English having to do with dissent and the way the government deals with it in contemporary Vietnam, concluded in the last chapter, Vietnam's government, quote, tolerates no dissent or opposition. Human Rights Watch, the U.S. State Department, as many of you know, often put out assessments of human rights and political conditions in various parts of the world, typically depict Vietnam's authorities as being extremely intolerant of political dissent of any kind. And yet, it doesn't take too much of observing in Vietnam, quite a bit. And to me, rather, given these kind of outside commentaries, remarkable extent of dissent and criticism, from covering a wide range of things, from lambasting corruption of local provincial authorities to demanding a multi-party political system, from protesting against working conditions in factories to criticizing the government's foreign policies. Public critics include thousands of workers, villagers, religious leaders, intellectuals, former government and Communist Party officials, among others. Some of these people have been forming organizations, including 3 political parties, which have websites and publications. The People's Democratic Party, the Democratic Party of Vietnam, and the Vietnamese and the Vietnam Progressive Party. Now, the government does not recognize these parties. They're not allowed to run candidates for election under party labels, but these things exist, and there are people affiliated with them who sometimes are harassed and arrested, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but other times go about their daily lives and political activities. There are also publications, such as these 3, which have been coming out pretty regularly ever since about April, May of 2006. The first one, Tuzo Zanju, means freedom and democracy. Tokuk means like homeland, fatherland, sometimes translated as fatherland, but it's really not gendered, it's homeland. And Tuzo Mongwai, meaning freedom of speech. These publications come out, the second 2 come out twice a month. You can get them on the web. In Vietnam, they're sometimes passed hand to hand, but a lot more people have access to the web and download them. There are occasions when the government puts up firewalls to try to prevent people from having access to them, but oftentimes the people who are putting these publications out have access or have ways of figuring out how to get around those firewalls. So my point here is, better than depicting the regime in Vietnam as always or nearly always being repressive, is to study the mix of repression and other kinds of actions, including toleration of protests and other public criticism in the country. Very little such analysis exists for Vietnam, and in my effort to try to see if there are similarities or not between Vietnam and China, I've also been learning that very little of this kind of analysis of the mixture of reactions of government exists for China as well. So my focus today is on one small aspect of a wide range of public political criticism. I want to focus on what I've come to call regime dissidence. These are Vietnamese in Vietnam. I'm not looking at Vietnamese living in Australia or the United States or France or elsewhere in the world. Vietnamese in Vietnam who publicly criticize and often oppose Vietnam's system of government, the Communist Party's domination of the state, and the Communist Party's efforts to control society. Now, we don't know how many of these regime dissidents exist. I've been trying to follow, using this kind of definition, follow as many as I can, and I have information on 62 that I'm focusing on today. And I did have a handout at the table in the back there. You may have got it as you came in. It's 2 pages. It's not stapled together. And it lists the names of these 62 individuals, and I clustered them in a way that I'll explain in a minute, and gives you a little bit of background as to their age, where they were born, education, occupation, and so forth. I have a spreadsheet that covers this length of this table that I've tried to keep track of various aspects of their lives based on a number of sources. I've used sources such as these 3 publications. Some of these people write in those publications. Some are talked about by other people writing in publications. There are other things on the web, which is really quite voluminous. I've had a research assistant part-time research assistant for a few years that's been helping me collect these materials. It's very hard to keep up. I also use publications of other sorts. There are some collection of essays published as books, published in a few cases in Vietnam. In several other cases, the authors couldn't or didn't want to have their collection of essays published in the country, so they're published in California or Australia or France or England. There are also quite a bit of coverage in the Vietnamese press in Vietnam about some of the kinds of activities that, well, certainly about a lot of the range of public political criticism in Vietnam. Workers' protests, villagers' protests, religious related protests. And sometimes the local press in Vietnam will also talk about these individuals that I've summarized and that I'm looking at this afternoon. So first, a few comments about summarizing these 62 people, these regime dissidents. Age-wise, they go from their mid-30s until their early 80s. About half of them were born after 1955, which means after the French-Vietnamese War ended and the country was theoretically independent, but then fairly quickly in 1954-55, by the Geneva Accord of 54, divided along the 17th parallel into North and South Vietnam. About a quarter of these people were born before 1941. 1941 was the kind of the beginning of what became the Japanese, together with the French occupation. France, you will probably recall, colonized Vietnam, began to rule it in the 1860s, 1870s until 1954. Occupation-wise, those born prior to 1955, many of them had careers in the government, in the military, in the Communist Party itself. Those born after 55 have very few of them have that kind of work experience. They have much broader careers in telecommunication, journalism, engineering, business, lawyers, physicians. Most of the 62, 53 of them are men and 9 are women. And they call themselves, in Vietnamese terms like Nguyen Phan Can, which means to resist, to be a resistor, or the Nha Wat Dao, Dân Chủ, meaning an for democracy. And the more common term is Nha Wat Dong Chinh Kien, which means a person with a different political view than the prevailing one. And I gloss this as political dissident. So these regime dissidents, political dissidents, the 62 that I've outlined, but there are others, are the type of public political criticism that I'm focusing on today. They have, and I'm going to try to summarize 3 main themes that run through their commentaries about Vietnam. There are some other issues that they talk about, but these are the 3 that are, I would say, almost universal among these 62 and others like them. The first first has to do with corruption. Ending corruption in Vietnam, which, and for these people, they're not talking about corruption with the local police or local authorities of the kind that maybe somebody has to deal with just going about getting official documentation or the like to build a house or start a small enterprise or what have you. They're talking about big-scale corruption. Millions of dollars, they allege, that is being siphoned off in the form of kickbacks, embezzlement for authorities working in banks and other state agencies. They're talking about prime ministers, the head of the party, other high-ranking officials of the ministries, and to some extent further down. Most of their commentary focuses on the major leaders and institutions. The solution they offer leads to the second theme, which I gloss as institutionalizing democracy. You can't, even in my computer, you can't read where the lighting is better. You can't read that sign, but it starts out with dumb mutant, meaning corruption, and it lists the dissent or criticism, the disgust of people with the authorities who are, quote, sucking the blood of people, says the second or third line here. And they go on to say, toward the end of this banner, that to correct this problem, we have to have pluralism and a multi-party system. Now, this banner was put up over a bridge in Hanoi. It lasted about an hour and a half, 2 hours. The authorities, the local police, tore it down. And one of the individuals who was allegedly was responsible for making it and putting it up was detained and later on arrested. So the second theme is institutionalizing democracy. Multi-party system, free and open elections, free press, the right to assemble, and other human rights which in the Vietnamese constitution are protected, but their argument is it's kind of at a paper level, not at a real level. And we also talk about, in terms of institutionalizing democracy, the separation of powers. The legislature separate from the executive and from the judiciary. The third theme has to do with what I put under a heading of national pride. And here there are sort of two sub-points that people are making in these regime dissidents. One is that looking at the Vietnamese situation today in terms of quality of education, quality of housing, quality of the public transportation system, income levels, proportion of population that's poor, Vietnam, they argue, comes off looking pretty bad. And they're ashamed, given Vietnam's long history, valiant history, a history to be respected. They are arguing authorities of today's Vietnam have let the country go to pot. It doesn't compare to a Singapore, doesn't compare to a South Korea, doesn't compare to a Taiwan, doesn't compare to Thailand, many of them argue. So that's one part of this national pride. The other has to do with the policies of the Vietnamese government toward China and the relationship between the two countries. And that's what this slide illustrates. So from time to time, there have been some very large demonstrations involving hundreds of people in Hanoi, in the north, in Hue, in the central part of the country, in Da Nang, which is near Hue, as well as all down to Ho Chi Minh City, that focuses on Vietnam and China's relations. And the argument that comes through is that many of these regime dissidents think that the Communist Party government in Vietnam has sold out the country to the Chinese investors who are putting huge amounts of money to exploit natural resources. The big issue on that is in the Central Highlands, where there are large reserves of bauxite have been discovered, which is used in the making of aluminum. It's a very messy, dirty, environmentally speaking process. The Chinese have been given a lot of allowance, license to come in and mine that and exploit those resources. People of the regime, dissidents, nature, and some others are very, very upset with this and say that it's an example of the Vietnamese government allowing China to get away with too much. The other issue on China is, which has been in the press here in the Philippines recently too, is the contending claims to the Spratlys and other parts of what are called the South China Sea. I noticed that Filipinos Congress, I think, has been trying to call it the Philippine East Sea. Huh? Thank you. West. The Vietnamese call it the Vietnamese East Sea. I think they should call it the Southeast Asia Sea. But, and recently, this demonstration in part was triggered by a large Chinese vessel which came down through the East Sea, West Sea, South China Sea, and cut some cables that were important for communication purposes and other things that were going to mainland Vietnam. And according to the regime critics, the Vietnamese authorities were very slow off the mark in raising much of an issue or a protest about it. So those are the three big themes. There are other things that I won't go into that these regime dissidents are talking about. To bring about the kinds of changes, they all agree on a nonviolent method. I think for some of them it's out of principle. For others, it's maybe out of a reality test, given the size and discipline of the Philippine military and police, and the difficulty of carrying out any kind of underground armed type of insurrection, although it's possible that such activities are happening. But among these regime dissidents, nonviolent struggle to bring about fundamental changes in the political system. Within that, there are kind of two prongs, two ways of doing this nonviolent struggle. One I call struggle through participation, represented by these two gentlemen, Hasi Fu and Lu Fu. Their emphasis is on engaging the state, wherever it is, at the local level, at the provincial level, at the national level. Whenever you see something that's going wrong, tell your authorities, make an issue out of it, file a petition, work with your neighbors, etc. In your everyday activities, in your neighborhoods, in where you work, where you go to school. And they point to this partly because they argue there's some success, there's a track record that this works in Vietnam. And the things they point to have to do with the economic transformation that's occurred in Vietnam since the latter part of the 1980s, early 1990s, where Vietnam moved very gradually, somewhat episodically, but eventually fairly firmly away from a centralized market to a more open, free market economic system. And these people argue that this happened not by authorities at the top or even in the middle deciding that they want to do that, but rather by bottom-up pressures as people tried to make a living under a system that wasn't working. The centralized economic system wasn't working. The other thing they point to is the decollectivization of land, which began in northern Vietnam in the late 50s and continued until the middle to late 1980s. In South Vietnam, it started after the war ended in 1975. It too, today in Vietnam, people farm as households. Their collective farming is gone and has been pretty much gone since the latter part of the 1912. I've written a book about this. It really starts in the 1970s. But it accelerates into the 1980s and early 90s, where land was decollectivized and household farming became the norm. So these critics were pushing for a struggle through participation. Look to these two big examples of how people's behavior every day, sometimes subtly, sometimes in the face of the local authorities, can make a difference. And they said we need to do this on the political institutions as well as the economic. The other path I call struggle through confrontation, represented by Chen Tin, who's a southerner, very active in opposition to the communist government, the communist party in the 1960s and 70s. So he's a Catholic priest. And Dong Nam Hai, a much younger fellow. Their argument is that everyday kind of participatory kind of confrontation or a struggle is maybe work for the economy, but it will not work for changing the political system. It won't move the Communist Party away from dominating. It won't move them toward multi-party elections. It won't move them to becoming more sincere about those human rights that are written in the Constitution but not practiced. They talk about the importance of organizing, of forming leaders and leadership or leader-led organizations that will push hard in large-scale way demonstrations to continue calling for open elections, etc. Authorities' reactions to these regime dissidents there's a range. At one level, there's some agreement between the authorities of Vietnam and these regime dissidents. For instance, corruption is an issue that national as well as local authorities in Vietnam talk a lot about. You can pick up almost any newspaper in Vietnam and read stories about, these are official newspapers, read stories about corrupt officials, what they've done, the importance of bringing them to justice. Some of these officials are eventually arrested, imprisoned, including vice ministers of some of the powerful ministries over the last few years, including the director of one of the state banks. So there's agreement about the corruption issue up to a point. There's also agreement about democracy. Vietnam's authorities talk about Vietnam as being a democracy. They talk a lot about democracy, the importance of the people having a say and holding government officials accountable, and so forth. And of course, the Vietnamese authorities emphasize nationalism and national pride. In fact, they argue that the Communist Party and its leadership has a lot to be proud of for having led a struggle against the French and then against the United States and eventually reunited the country. The difference has to do in the meaning of these terms. What does democracy mean for the officials isn't what it means for these regime dissidents. There's different, so that to the point that while at some level they can talk to each other, fairly quickly these differences of meaning lead to regimes seeing these dissidents as major threats to the party, to the government, and to the stability of the country. So within the leadership of the Communist Party, the government of Vietnam, I think there's some debate about how to deal with the regime dissidents. It's very hard for me, and for others that I've talked to, it's pretty hard for them as well, including Vietnamese, to piece together the components of the debates and who's saying what at what time and to whom. But broadly speaking, there is a voice within this intra-party, intra-government discussion to have dialogue with these regime dissidents, to engage them and try to have an open discussion about these meanings of democracy, of national pride, and so forth. What is the real cause of corruption? Is it the one-party state, as the dissidents say, or are there other things going on? And this kind of dialogue has happened from time to time, usually with retired prominent Vietnamese officials who will sit down literally at their home or in an office and talk with people such as some of those listed on that handout. But that's not the norm. Another part of the discussion about how to deal with the dissidents is to try to put them down, to criticize them in public. So that's where you get some stories in the local press about some of these individuals or some of the organizations they formed or some of these magazines that I mentioned. And there's the tone of the articles often isn't very negative. You could almost say slander the individuals involved, alleging things that they've done that they may or may not have done. Casting doubts as to their credibility, of their honesty, of what their real intentions are, and so forth. There's also harassment of the dissidents, threatening them, tapping their phones, cutting their access to communications, blocking their mobile phones, cutting them off from the net, hacking their computers, getting their email lists, etc. Sometimes there's violence against the critics, causing traffic accidents such that one of the dissidents riding on a motor scooter might get hit, fall off, and break a leg, or end up in the hospital. Muggings have been reported. This slide shows the home, or what was the home of Sung Ki Swan, which was bulldozed in the outskirts of Hanoi. The authorities claim that it was built illegally, it didn't have the proper permits on land that wasn't supposed to be built on, at least for housing. Although nearby there are homes which weren't bulldozed. Her point, and the people who support her, is that she's being picked on because she's active in she's one of the editors of one of those magazines that I mentioned earlier, and she's also a first cousin of a prominent regime dissident. Another form of reaction of authorities toward dissidents is confinement of various forms. Detaining them temporarily and letting them go, detaining them, interrogating them, letting them go home. Arrest is another form of detainment, or an accelerated form. And then if arrested, sometimes prosecuting and bringing people to trial and imprisoning them. What I want to focus on now for a while is the curiosity here, or the differences in how, the extent to which confinement happens and to whom. Confinement does not happen to all of the regime dissidents, and the degree and form of confinement varies from occasional detainment to a lengthy prison term. And whatever the form of confinement, simple interrogation from time to time or actual imprisonment, rarely stops the regime dissidents from resuming their activity. So using these two variables, the extent of confinement and the persistence of dissent, I've used the 62 to form 6 clusters. The first, and on the handout, that's how I organized these 62 names. The first are people who have, despite their persistent criticism, calling for these major changes that I highlighted, have not been detained, let alone arrested. 4 of them. Now the thing that kind of holds them together is that they're all up in age, late 50s, 60s, into their 70s. They've all had positions in the government at one time or another in their careers before retiring. And in 3 of the 4 cases, they were very active in the anti-French and or American wars for Vietnam. So maybe that background is giving them some protection. The second category are people who have been arrested or detained, sometimes quite often, but no imprisonment, never actually brought to trial, convicted, and put in jail. Yet after their detention, after their interrogation, in many cases, they continue their dissent, and maybe they're detained 2 or 3 years later, or the next month. They're interrogated, told, asked what they were doing, etc., and then they're let go. Possibly, there are 11 of those. In 4, after this happened to them on a number of occasions, and for other reasons, they managed to leave Vietnam. One is Sun Tu Hung, who's a novelist, now living in Paris. In other cases, it's unclear why they've been detained, but not held and eventually imprisoned. Possibly advanced age is a factor. In some cases they were, or their parents were, Communist Party leaders, or fought in the revolutions against France and for independence and against the United States to reunify the country. The third group have been convicted and imprisoned once, get out of prison, resume their public political criticism, calling for these major changes, that have not been rearrested. They've been sometimes detained again, but not re-imprisoned or even brought to trial. In some cases, I think the explanation has to do that among these 21, there are about a half dozen who are advocates of this participatory struggle approach rather than the confrontational approach. But that doesn't explain the other cases, which so far I've not been able to really understand why they're treated somewhat differently than others. There is a group, 6 individuals, who have been in prison, get out of prison, resume their political criticism, and then have been re-imprisoned again, arrested, brought to trial, and imprisoned again. 6 of them. What I think distinguishes 4 out of these 6 is that they are among the very, very early critics, public critics of the government, going back to the 1960s. They were very easy targets. They were pretty much alone. They were arrested. Some of them served fairly lengthy terms in jail. They got out. They resumed, and they're kind of lightning rods, attracting a lot of attention by authorities and used by authorities as an example, I think. And hence that partly explains the fact that they were early activists, continued, the government's continuing to try to silence them. The 5th group are people who, 17 out of the 62 who are currently in prison. And we don't know, of course, what will happen. And in prison for the first time. We don't know what their actions will be after getting out of prison. And then this last group, just 3 people who, after being in prison for the first time, in one case of these 3, just not even in prison, just confined, seems to have, the other 2 were in prison and released. These 3, as best as I can tell, have not resumed their public political criticism, they kind of dropped out of sight. It's possible that they have gone underground and doing things subterraneanly that we can't detect, and they're not out in the public realm, which is the realm that I've been focusing on. Or maybe they've just become intimidated. But if that's the case, it's very, very few out of the 62 who have taken that route, deciding that it's not worth their trouble to continue their trying to bring about political change and through their demonstrations, through their publications and the like. Let me say a few words about trials and the length of sentences and to prison of the people who do end up being not only detained but in prison, brought to trial and in prison. Usually the trials are short, a day, 2 days, maybe 3 days. Very little public access. Sometimes family members can come to a trial in a court. People hang around outside the courthouse, as this slide suggests. People who are trying to get in. Usually to get into a trial, we have to get permission ahead of time. We have to have the right kind of piece of paper, and so forth. Some trials are more open. They might have 20 or 30 people from sort of off the street, but that's fairly rare. Usually somebody brought on charges that have to do with their political commentary and actions will have a legal counsel, but often the lawyers have difficulty meeting very much with their clients prior to trial. The authorities make it hard for attorneys to do their job. And sometimes attorneys who have been active and trying to defend some of these regime dissidents, in the course of doing that activity, either that effort or the government says it's other things they've done. In any case, these attorneys sometimes get brought to trial themselves as on charges. They end up bringing them to trial, as happened in the case of this gentleman sitting on the far right to you, Benedict, who's an attorney, had served as an attorney for several people in the past who were brought up on charges having to do with their political activities. Eventually, he, in 2010, I think 2009, he was arrested, brought to trial in 2010, and was convicted to 5 years in prison. Not because of, according to the government, not because of his lawyering activities or even his help with other regime dissidents, but because he was active in some illegal organizations, according to the authorities. The charges on which people are convicted and imprisoned have shifted, I think, over time. Prior to 2000, the year 2000, about half of the convictions were on pretty heavy-duty crimes from the point of view of the government. People being convicted of having engaged in espionage, of having revealed state secrets, of having incited rebellion. Those are 3 common charges and convictions prior to the year 2000 and tended to bring heavy sentences. Since 2000, those kind of charges are very rare. Most of the charges are what I would regard as, and I think the people themselves regard as a lighter type: disturbing the peace, spreading propaganda against the state, and abusing their democratic rights. I mentioned that the Vietnamese Constitution does allow for freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc. But the practice is different, and one of the crimes in the criminal code in Vietnam is abusing your democratic rights. So those three kinds of things are very common charges. Spreading propaganda especially is common. Prison terms, in the early years, those ones that I mentioned that were arrested in the 60s and 70s were given 10-year, 11-year types of sentences. That, in the 1990s, that lessened. Most imprisonment terms for people brought to trial, convicted, imprisoned in 1990 to 1999 were for less than 2 years. The longest term was 7 years. Since 2000, over the last 10, 11 years, it's kind of crept back a little bit to longer terms. But still, over half are less than 4 to 5 years. Very few are more than 6 or 7 years. But there is one recent conviction that is for 16 years. He's still in prison. However, it's also interesting to note that a trial and a conviction, telling so-and-so you have to serve a 5-year sentence or a 6-year sentence or a 7-year sentence, the actual term in prison is often less. More than half of the convictions and prison terms that I've looked at among the people who ended up in prison have served less time than they were actually told by the court initially to serve, because of either good behavior or legal procedures were taken to appeal the decision and or the sentence, and over time those appeals in some cases have won, such as in the case of Lê Nguyen San, who the leader of one of those political parties that I mentioned earlier on. This slide shows him after the court had convicted him to 5 years imprisonment, but he actually ended up serving 4 and was released August of last year. The relationship between offense and prison term is somewhat elusive. I mentioned for heavy-duty crimes, it's pretty straightforward. People charged with rebellion or inciting, spreading state secrets will get fairly lengthy sentences, 6, 7, 8, maybe longer years. For those who are convicted for lesser offenses, the range of imprisonment tends to vary from a few months to several years, and it's not clear to me why. The penal code allows the judges some flexibility, or why in some cases a person convicted of, say, spreading propaganda against the state or disturbing the peace can get a few months in prison, and somebody else with the same charges ends up in another court a few months later getting a 2-year sentence. I'm not sure about that. Some people I talked to in Vietnam say that it has to do with the demeanor of the accused. If the accused is kind of humble and quiet and doesn't talk back very much to the judge, they tend to be looked more favorably than somebody who's more aggressive. So to conclude, being a regime dissident is risky in Vietnam, even though the 62 dissidents that I've been talking about have not threatened or used violence or armed struggle against the state authorities, treat them in some fairly heavy-handed ways. Authorities can and do mess up people's lives, take away their jobs, intimidate their relatives, interfere with their daily activities, interrogate them as they're going to work, coming home from work, while they're in school, sometimes beat them, sometimes imprison them. Nevertheless, data on the regime dissidents and state authorities' actions toward them do not support a conclusion that Vietnam's Communist Party government tolerates no dissent. There is some toleration. Also, the repression is not uniform. A few regime dissidents have not been detained, despite years of public political criticism. Several others who were detained have never been imprisoned, even though they have persisted openly with their criticism. Others have been imprisoned, but after getting out of jail and resuming their political dissent, they were not re-imprisoned. Analysis provides no clear explanation for such varying degrees of repression against the dissidents. About the most I can say, based on the data that I've got at hand, is that being elderly and having a history of service to the government and or the party, Communist Party, appears to reduce a dissident's risk of being arrested and imprisoned, or if imprisoned, the length of the person's term. Not being closely involved with an organized, an organization that's critical of the government also seems to play a factor in whether a person is given a lengthy sentence or even brought to trial at all. Those who take a more confrontational approach have a higher risk than those taking the participatory type of approach to their criticism. So that's about as much as I can say this afternoon. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions.